The first time I understood that my niece intended to erase me, she was standing in the front window of my bookstore with a staple gun in her hand. Rain was needling against the glass. The street outside was blurred silver and red from brake lights and umbrellas. I had only been gone 43 minutes, long enough to get stitches removed from my wrist and pick up the anti-inflammatory my doctor insisted I take with food. When I came back, there was a sign hanging inside my own window. Coming soon, Blackthorn & Co., a new chapter for Harbor Street. My store was called Bellwether Books. It had been called Bellwether Books for 27 years. I stood just inside the door with the bell still trembling above my head, grocery pharmacy bag in one hand, rainwater dripping from the hem of my coat, and watched my niece press one final staple into the frame, like she was doing something generous, helpful, necessary. Then she stepped back, smiled at her own reflection in the glass, and said without turning around, "It reads cleaner this way, don't you think?" I remember the smell before I remember anything else. Wet wool from my coat, paper, old floorboards carrying that faint mineral smell they get in bad weather, and beneath it, the chemical sharpness of fresh ink and new vinyl from the sign she had printed without telling me. My wrist began to throb. "Lena," I said, and my own voice sounded strange to me. Thin. "What is that?" She turned then, all confidence and soft cashmere and the kind of bright energy people mistake for competence because it arrives wearing expensive boots. She was 31, my sister's daughter, and 5 months earlier I would have told you she was the closest thing I had to a child. "It's temporary branding," she said, "just until the relaunch. I didn't want to bother you before the appointment." Relaunch. The word seemed to strike the shelves and come back at me. Bellwether Books had survived 2 recessions, a roof leak, online retail, a city council streetscape disaster that closed our block for 11 weeks, and the winter after my husband died when I opened every morning with my hands shaking so hard I could barely fit the key into the lock. Relaunch, she said, as though it had failed, as though it had ended. I set the pharmacy bag down on the front counter with more care than was necessary. If I had not done that carefully, I think I might have thrown it. "You took my sign down?" She hesitated, just a fraction. Then, "I had it put in storage, safely. Oliver said the old one was visually tired." Oliver was her boyfriend, consultant, according to him. Mostly he wore very clean jackets and spoke in sentences that sounded like captions under magazine photographs. I looked above the front till where my hand-painted sign usually hung. Deep green with gold leaf lettering my husband had applied himself one summer when business was finally good enough for us to do things beautifully instead of cheaply. It was gone. The hooks were still there. That was the moment, if I am honest, when something inside me began to harden, not explode, not shatter, harden. Because this story did not begin in the rain with a staple gun and a stranger's name in my window. It began the previous autumn, with a phone call on a Monday night and my sister crying so hard I could barely understand her. My sister Nora had always been the kind of person life found early. Marriage at 19, Lena at 20. Trouble after that in irregular but dependable waves. Money, men, the wrong trust placed in the wrong people. I was 4 years older, and by some combination of caution and luck, ended up the steadier one. I married Daniel. We bought the shop. We stayed. Nora drifted. She called me from the oncology ward just after 10. Stage 4, she said. Aggressive. They'd found it too late. Lena was with her, but Lena was falling apart, and could I please talk to her because Lena always listened to me in a way she no longer listened to anyone else. I did talk to her, that night and many nights after. If you want to understand why I let her so far into my life, you need to understand that grief arrived before the trouble did. Real grief, The kind that strips all the performative edges off people and leaves them raw and childlike and stunned. Lena slept in the fold-out chair beside her mother's bedside for almost 2 weeks. I brought clothes, coffee, charger cables, soup neither of them touched. She would meet me in the corridor with her eyes swollen and her hair scraped into a knot and say, "I don't know how to do this." "No one does," I told her. Nora died in November, 11 days before the first frost. At the funeral, Lena stood so still beside the casket that I thought she might faint. Afterwards, she came back to my house because there was nowhere else she wanted to go, and she sat at my kitchen table with both hands around a cup of tea gone cold and asked, "What did people do after everybody left?" I told her the truth. They washed dishes, they folded chairs, they found hairpins in coat pockets and sympathy cards under fruit bowls. They kept waking up. 3 weeks later, she lost her apartment. That part sounds dramatic, but the reality was smaller and more humiliating than drama. Her mother had been helping with the rent. Lena had been freelancing, brand copy, social media contracts, things that looked impressive in proposal decks and unreliable in bank statements. Then, one of her biggest clients vanished mid-project. Another paid late. By December, she was trying to clear out her mother's condo and negotiate with a landlord who had already been patient longer than the lease required. "I just need a little time," she said. We were in the stockroom at the shop because I had asked her to help me unpack holiday inventory. There were boxes open on the floor, tissue paper everywhere, and she was sitting cross-legged with a pricing gun in one hand, looking suddenly much younger than 31. "Come stay with me," I said. It was easy, a sentence then. I lived alone above the store in the apartment Daniel and I had renovated ourselves over 12 years of Sundays and compromises. The shop below, apartment above, narrow staircase in back, kitchen looking over the alley, bedroom facing the harbor if you leaned just right by the window. Daniel had died 3 years ago of a stroke that took him one afternoon after giving me 32 years of marriage and exactly enough warning to hold his hand and not enough warning to prepare for the silence. After he died, people asked whether I would sell. I didn't. The store was not just a business, it was the shape my life had taken. It was where Daniel whistled while repairing shelves, where he taught high school history until retirement, and then spent mornings arguing amicably with customers about biographies and sea voyages. He painted the sign Lena later removed. So when she said she needed a little time, I offered the room across from mine without much thought. Family, winter, grief. That was the whole equation as I saw it. She moved in on a drizzly Saturday with 4 suitcases, 2 banker's boxes of paperwork from her mother's estate, and a framed photograph of herself and Nora on a beach in Cape Breton, and a potted olive tree that immediately began dropping leaves on my stair landing. For the first month, she was easy to have. That is important. People always imagine these things begin with obvious malice. They usually do not. They begin with relief. She slept late, she cried in private, or she thought she did. She offered to help in the store and actually helped do, dusting lower shelves, updating a neglected events calendar, making us both lunch when I was too busy to go upstairs. Customers liked her. She had her mother's dark hair and the kind of alert face that made people tell her more than they intended. At Christmas, she insisted on stringing new lights around the front display. "They'll draw the eye from the corner," she said. She was right. In January, she redesigned our newsletter. It looked cleaner than the one I had been sending from a free template in 2014. In February, she built an online pre-order page for signed copies from a local author event and tripled attendance. I was tired that winter, more tired than I let myself admit. My right wrist had been bothering me for months from lifting boxes and shelving hardcovers. The stairs seemed steeper. The bookkeeping felt like a language I once knew fluently and was beginning to lose by neglect. Lena was fast where I was methodical, confident where I still believed most things required asking permission from life before attempting them. "She's good for the place," my part-time clerk, Miriam, told me one Thursday as we watched Lena rearrange the front table by color rather than genre. Miriam had worked for me 16 years. She was 70 if she was a day, wore silver rings on every finger, and could hand-sell a novel better than any algorithm alive. "She is," I said, and I meant it. The first sign of trouble was so small I almost dismissed it. I came downstairs one morning and found that my husband's ledger was no longer on the counter by the till. It was a thick black book Daniel had used for years before we computerized most things. We no longer need it for inventory, but I kept it there anyway, because his notes were filled with the margins: customer birthdays, out-of-print treasures to hunt down, brief opinions on books in a cramped, slanting hand. I kept it by the till because I liked touching something he had touched thousands of times. That morning, it was gone. I found it on a shelf behind the register. I looked at her. Daniel kept it there. Her expression shifted into something patient, not apologetic, patient. "I know, but new customers don't know what it is, and first visual impressions matter." I took the ledger out, set it back where it belonged, and said nothing else. Not because I approved, because I did not yet understand I was witnessing a philosophy. To me, objects carried history. To Lena, objects carried messaging. After that, the changes came in faster. A stack of handwritten staff recommendation cards on the fiction tables disappeared and were replaced with uniform printed placards in a sans serif font I disliked on sight. The old brass bell on the counter stopped appearing because, according to Lena, it made the checkout area feel antique in the wrong way. A local poet who had been doing our spring reading for 7 consecutive years was postponed, which turned out to mean canceled, because his audience skewed older and she wanted to shift the demographic. I objected to that one. "Arthur has been coming here since before you were born," I said. She was sitting on a stepladder repricing new arrivals with a speed that looked efficient until you noticed she was not checking half the ISBNs. "And we love Arthur," she said, "but if we keep programming for the exact same crowd, we'll age with them." "We have aged with them," I said. "That is what community is." She smiled in a way that made me feel as though I had delivered a charming line in a play whose ending she already knew. "Community has to renew itself, Aunt Viv." My name is Vivian, though only family ever called me Viv. Daniel called me V. Lena knew that. The sudden softening of my name should have felt affectionate. It did not. It felt managerial. By April, she had persuaded me to let her temporarily take over our social media and event partnerships because, as she put it, you shouldn't still be answering DMs at 11 o'clock at night. This was true. I should not have been. But the platforms were tangled into the work now, and if I did not answer messages, people assumed we were closed or indifferent or dead. So I let her, temporarily. 2 weeks later, I realized I no longer had the passwords. "It's easier if one person manages the brand voice," she said. I remember standing in the office doorway with my sore wrist braced against the frame and hearing the word brand voice applied to a bookstore my husband and I had opened with a second mortgage and second-hand shelves, and something in me recoiled. "Send me the login details," I said. "Of course," she said. She did not. Around then, Oliver began appearing more often. Tall, good teeth, expensive watch, the kind of man who looked around every room as if calculating its unrealized value. He called me Vivian from the start, which should not have mattered, and did. He complimented the store in the impersonal way developers compliment historical buildings right before gutting them. "What you have here is special," he told me one evening after close, hands in pockets, gaze traveling the ceiling tin and rolling ladders. "It just needs sharper positioning." I was kneeling on the floor, unpacking a shipment of children's books. "It's a bookstore," I said. He smiled as though I had been quaint on purpose. That's exactly the problem. Lena laughed from behind the counter, and I laughed too, because that is what women my age have too often trained themselves to do when younger people are rude in polished language. In May, I tore the tendon sheath in my wrist lifting a carton of art monographs I had no business lifting alone. The pain was immediate and blinding, white, hot. I made a sound I had never heard out of myself, and the next thing I knew, Miriam was helping me sit down on the office stool while Lena called urgent care. The doctor strapped my wrist, prescribed rest I could not afford, and asked whether I had staff who could handle operations for a few weeks. I do, I said. It felt practical. It turned out to be the hinge on which the rest of the story swung. For the next month, I was present but limited. I could still read invoices, still advise customers, still open and close, but I could not lift, carry, shelve, or do the long repetitive till work with pain. Lena stepped in everywhere. She was good with suppliers, good with event people, good on camera for the little videos she suddenly insisted we needed. Just for momentum, she said. Every improvement came wrapped in necessity. By June, several things had happened so gradually that I only saw the full pattern when I stopped long enough to list them. Miriam's hours had been reduced because Lena said payroll needed tightening. Our poetry section had been cut in half to make room for lifestyle-adjacent inventory, which turned out to be candles, ceramic match holders, linen-bound journals, and 2 shelves of imported skincare no one had asked for. The children's nook Daniel built with rounded corners and a painted mural of woodland animals was stripped of its rug, beanbags, and puppets in favor of modular seating in a color Lena called oat. And perhaps most importantly, suppliers had begun emailing Lena directly, not copying her, directly. I discovered this because a sales rep I had worked with for 13 years mentioned in passing that Lena had told them we were moving in a more elevated curation direction. I asked to see that email. He forwarded it. It was signed Lena Rowe, Creative Director of Blackthorn & Co. Blackthorn had been Nora's maiden name, our maiden name. She had taken it and turned it into a title, a future, a thing with business cards, apparently, because I later found a stack of them in the office drawer where I kept stamps. I went upstairs that night and sat at my kitchen table long after the kettle had gone cold. The apartment above the store always sounded different after dark. The hum of refrigeration below, occasional footsteps from the alley, harbor hogthorn in bad weather. Daniel used to say buildings speak if you live with them long enough. Mine was telling me something then, though I did not yet want to hear it clearly. Lena came in around 11 carrying takeout I had not asked for. "You need to eat," she said. I looked at her across the table. Why are there business cards downstairs calling you creative director of a company that does not exist? She stopped with the chopsticks halfway out of the paper sleeve. Then she set them down. I was going to tell you when it was more developed. There is nothing to develop. Bellwether Books exists. It is downstairs. She exhaled, not guilty, annoyed. Aunt Viv, Bellwether has history, yes, but history is not strategy. There it was again, that flattening, that way of speaking in clean nouns that removed all the blood from a thing. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" I asked. She pulled out the chair opposite me and sat down as though this was the conversation she had been waiting to have. "Saving it," she said. I laughed once. Just once. It did not sound pleasant. The store is solvent. For now. It has been solvent for 27 years.
"And the street has changed," she said immediately. "Consumer behavior has changed. Margin structures have changed. You know that. We can either become a destination or become sentimental roadkill." I stared at her. There are sentences that end relationships even before anyone stands up from the table. That may have been one of them. She leaned forward, voice lowering into persuasion. I'm not the enemy here. I'm trying to build something that could actually carry your legacy forward instead of letting it dwindle because you're attached to old signage and dead inventory weight and customers who buy one paperback every 6 weeks. My legacy. As if I were already gone. I should have stopped it then. Cleanly. Absolutely. I know that now. But grief had made me lenient, and loneliness had made me slow to identify invasion when it arrived dressed as usefulness. Also, and this is harder to admit, I had begun to doubt myself. Pain does that. Fatigue does that. So does watching someone younger move through systems more quickly than you can. "What exactly have you promised people?" I asked. "Nothing binding." That turned out not to be true. The midpoint of this story, the place where everything tilted and could no longer be mistaken for misunderstanding, arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in July, hot enough that the front windows sweated, the air conditioner in the back office rattling like it might surrender at any moment. A man I did not know came in carrying a laser measuring tool and a clipboard. He was wearing work boots and a polo with the logo of a local design firm. "Afternoon," he said. "I'm here for the site walk." I was at the counter alone. Lena had gone to meet Oliver for coffee, which I later learned was one of many coffees dedicated to discussing the life cycle of my store without me. "I'm sorry?" He glanced at his clipboard. "Blackthorn & Co. reconfiguration? We're 10 minutes early, actually." There are moments when comprehension does not arrive all at once. It arrives in fragments that cut on the way in. Reconfiguration. Sidewalk. Blackthorn. "I think you have the wrong place," I said. He frowned, looked around, then back at the clipboard. "No, unit's right. Lena Rowe confirmed." My body went very still. What exactly did she confirm? He hesitated then, the way tradespeople do when they sense domestic trouble and would greatly prefer not to be inside it. Concept refresh, millwork, front-of-house revisions, fixture swap, possible cafe integration phase 2. Cafe integration. I actually put my hand on the counter because the room shifted slightly. "Do you have paperwork?" I asked. He did. He should not have shown it to me, perhaps, but I think my face told him enough. He handed me the top page, and there, under a rendered logo for Blackthorn & Co., was a projected budget in 5 figures and a phased timeline beginning in August. On page 3 was a notation that made my vision sharpen in a cold, almost pleasant way. Landlord preliminary verbal interest in long-term concept repositioning, subject to ownership alignment. Ownership alignment? Now the building was mine. Daniel and I had bought it 12 years after opening the shop, when the previous landlord retired. There was no landlord above me, only the mortgage, nearly finished. But the designer did not know that, which meant someone had told him otherwise, or let him assume. When Lena came back 40 minutes later, flushed from the heat and carrying an iced coffee, she found me sitting in the office with the paperwork spread out on Daniel's desk. She stopped in the doorway. The silence between us was so clean it almost rang. "What is this?" I asked. She closed the door behind her. I noticed that before anything else, the soft click of the latch. "I was going to bring you in when it was less abstract." "Bring me in?" She set the coffee down carefully. "Yes." I looked at the pages. "You are planning renovations to a business you do not own under a name I did not approve, using title language that implies authority you do not have." "That is one way to say it." I looked up. The coolness in her voice then stripped away the last of my doubt. This was not confusion, not over-enthusiasm, not grief mismanaged. This was intent. "What is the other way?" I asked. She folded her arms. "The other way is that I have spent 8 months rescuing a store you were letting calcify, and I am no longer willing to pretend asking permission for every necessary decision is workable." Necessary. Such a useful word for tyrants of small domains. "You had no right." "I have every practical right because without me, this place would still be posting blurry author photos and carrying 17 copies of books no one under 60 is buying." I stood then, slowly, because if I moved too quickly, I might have struck her, and I have never struck anyone in my life. "Listen carefully," I said. "You are living in my home, working in my store, spending my money." "I have not spent your money." "Then whose budget is that?" Silence. Just one beat. Long enough. My mouth went dry. "Lena," I said, "what have you done?" She did not answer immediately. She walked past me, lifted one of the papers, then set them down, aligning the corners with a neatness I found suddenly obscene. "When you hurt your wrist, you signed authorization for me to manage business banking temporarily. I had a narrow authorization because the bank required an in-person signature and I could not write cleanly for 2 weeks. Deposit handling, vendor payments, operational access. What did you do with it?" She streamlined. "How much?" Again, that hesitation. Tiny. Fatal. "Lena." She gave me the number. It was not enough to ruin me. It was enough that I had to sit down. She began talking quickly after that, perhaps because my silence frightened her more than shouting would have. She said it wasn't theft because it was investment. She said deposits would cover some of it. Oliver had fronted some of it. There were refundable components. She had every intention of making it back within 12 months post-rebrand. She had built decks, forecasts, collaborations, a launch sequence, a feature in a regional lifestyle magazine if timing aligned. I listened to every word and understood almost none of it emotionally, because the central fact had already landed. My niece had reached into my accounts and begun building her future inside my life without consent. Then came the line that reframed everything. "I couldn't wait forever," she said, and for the first time her voice cracked with something real. There it was, not strategy, hunger, not about the store alone, about inheritance of a kind no law had promised her.
I looked at her face, my sister's mouth, my mother's eyebrows, eyes bright with grievance rather than remorse, and saw, perhaps too late, how deeply she had mistaken proximity for entitlement. "You're right," I said. "I would not have chosen this." That night I did not sleep. I sat in the apartment with every light off except the stove hood and listened to Lena moving in the guest room across the hall. Drawer, footsteps, water running. Once, quietly, crying. My own body felt curiously calm. That is another truth about crisis. Sometimes emotion arrives later, after logistics. First comes the list. Call bank. Change access. Review authorization scope. Check invoices. Call lawyer. At 8:05 the next morning, I called my lawyer. Her name was Elise Morrow, and she had handled the building purchase with Daniel 15 years earlier. Practical woman, kind only when useful. By noon, she had seen the banking paperwork. By 3, she had said the words I had needed and dreaded. She exceeded scope. By 5, the temporary authorization was revoked, online access reset, and a fraud hold placed on 2 pending vendor transfers Lena had tried to push through that morning. I did not tell Lena any of this immediately. I wanted records first, full ones, and I wanted to decide whether I was dealing with a desperate family member or someone who had crossed a threshold from which we could not come back. That decision was made for me 48 hours later. We were in the store before opening, light slanting through the front windows, dust floating in it, the street still quiet except for delivery trucks. I was at the counter reviewing statements Elise had printed. Lena came downstairs late, barefoot in the stockroom clogs she borrowed when rushed, hair still damp. "You froze the account," she said. Not a question. "Yes." Her face changed. Until then, I think she still believed this was negotiable, that there would be a period of upset followed by some ugly but survivable compromise in which I admitted she had gone too far but also conceded her vision had merit, that I would be hurt, perhaps furious, but ultimately manipulable through fatigue, affection, and the fear of seeming old-fashioned. When she saw my face, she understood something else. "You gave this place a future, you gave it nostalgia." There are accusations so precisely wrong they become clarifying. I thought of Daniel on a ladder painting letters by hand because we could not afford a sign maker, of Miriam shelving books during the year her husband left, of children who grew up in our reading corner and now brought their own children, of the winter a fisherman came in every Tuesday just to stand by the radiator and ask what to read next because the sea had taken enough from him already, of the ledger, of the bell, of the mural. Nostalgia was not the word for stewardship. I said, "You need to leave." She actually looked confused. "What?" "I am entirely serious." "You can't be serious." "I am entirely serious." "You have nowhere lined up." "That should have concerned you before you stole from me." "I did not steal from you." "You may explain that distinction to someone else." Her breath quickened. Mine did not. The calm had become almost frightening by then. "Aunt Viv?" "No." I had not raised my voice. I did then, just once. The single syllable cracked through the store hard enough that Miriam, coming in through the back door, stopped in the stockroom and did not step forward. Lena looked over my shoulder, saw we were not alone, and something like humiliation moved across her face. Good, I thought. Then immediately disliked myself for thinking it. "I will give you until 6. Your things from the apartment, nothing from the office, nothing from the till, nothing from inventory. Elise will send formal notice regarding the accounts." "You involved outsiders in this?" "You made outsiders part of it when you hired them." Tears sprang to her eyes then, sudden and furious. Not soft tears, the kind that arrive when pride is injured. "You know what?" she said. "Fine. Keep your little shrine, keep your dusty customers and your dead husband's notes and your stupid bell. See how long sentiment pays the mortgage." The cruelty of that sentence would have mattered more if it had come from someone already falling. She went upstairs, fast, hard footsteps, one suitcase wheel banging the edge of every stair on the way back down. Miriam came quietly to the counter. "I heard enough," she said. I nodded. "Do you need tea or police?" I laughed then, a short, broken sound that turned halfway into something else. She put a hand on my good shoulder and waited until I stopped. "Tea first," I said. Lena was gone by 5:12. Oliver arrived at 5:20, all contained outrage, to collect the olive tree, 2 garment bags, and what I can only describe as the remaining pieces of an ego expensive enough to require special handling. He tried once, briefly, to talk to me on the landing. This didn't need to become punitive. It became punitive when she mistook access for ownership. He looked at me in a new way then, more carefully. Men like Oliver are often surprised to discover that women they dismissed as sentimental are perfectly capable of clarity when the hour requires it. He left without another word. I wish I could tell you the next part was quiet. It was not. 3 days later, a teaser post went live on the store's social media, my store's social media, to which Lena still had access through a linked scheduling platform neither of us had remembered existed. Something sleek and sepia-toned. Close-up of coffee poured into a ceramic cup. New era coming soon. The comments filled within an hour. Excitement from people who had no idea. Confusion from regulars. One message from Arthur, the poet, that simply read, "Vivian, what on earth is this?" I took the post down, locked everything I could find, and put up a statement under the real name of the shop. Bellwether Books is and remains independently owned by Vivian Hale. Any recent materials suggesting otherwise were unauthorized. The store is open as usual. Thank you for your continued trust. Then I spent the afternoon answering calls from customers who had been polite enough to verify rather than assume. There is no exhaustion quite like public correction of a private betrayal. But the true climactic moment, the one people would probably expect earlier because it is visibly dramatic, came a week later at the Summer Street Festival. Harbor Street closed to traffic every August for one Saturday. Tents, musicians, sidewalk sales, children with painted faces, tourists buying things they did not need. It had always been one of our best days. I considered not participating that year. I was tired. The accounts were still being sorted. Elise had sent demand letters. Lena had not responded directly, only through a brief email from some junior lawyer insisting there had been reasonable belief of operational partnership, which is a phrase that deserved to be laughed out of court. But Bellwether had done the festival every year since the second one ever held, and I refused to let absence tell a story on my behalf. So we set up. Miriam in her wide straw hat, 2 folding tables, discount baskets out front, staff picks, children's paperbacks clipped to twine, the old brass bell back on the till, Daniel's sign re-hung above the doorway after I retrieved it myself from the storage unit Lena had paid for. By 11, the street was crowded and humid and loud with saxophone from the corner stage. At 12:30, I saw the tent. Half a block down, near the florist. Matte black tablecloth, white floral arrangements, poster boards, architectural renderings clipped to easels. Blackthorn & Co., coming fall. For a few seconds, I could not move. Then I saw Lena. She was in a cream jumpsuit, smiling at passers-by, handing out cards. Oliver beside her in navy, gesturing at the boards. And on one of those boards, large enough to be read from halfway down the street, was a rendering of my shopfront, my windows, my door, my cornice, rebranded. I handed the till to Miriam. She said, "Don't do anything I'd do." I make no promises. The crowd seemed to part around me and not part at all. Heat rising off the pavement, someone laughing too loudly, lemon sugar from the crepe stand in the air. My heartbeat no longer calm. Good, appropriate, finally. Lena saw me when I was 10 feet away. The smile left her face. I stopped in front of the tent and looked first at the rendering, then at her. "No," I said. That was all. Just no. A couple nearest to the boards glanced between us and drifted away. Lena set down the brochures. "You're making a scene. You built one. This is concept marketing. This is my building." Oliver stepped in then, naturally. Men like him always do when women's anger threatens to become legible. "Vivian, I think everyone would benefit from a calmer setting." I turned to him. "You are done speaking for spaces that do not belong to you." A little hush had formed, the way public hushes do. Never total silence, just a pocket where nearby people start pretending not to listen while hearing every word. Lena folded her arms, but I could see the strain in her neck. "You can't stop an idea."
"No," I said, "but I can stop fraud." That landed harder because I said it plainly. I reached into my bag and took out the envelope Elise had told me to carry in case of further misrepresentation. Inside were copies: the deed, the incorporation papers, the cease and desist, the demand letter. Not dramatic papers. Better than dramatic. Real. I set them on the table, one atop the other, beside the little vase of white ranunculus she had chosen because they photographed well. "You will take down every image of my property. You will stop using my family name to imply succession you do not possess. And if you continue representing this business, this building, or these accounts as part of your venture, the next conversation will not happen on a sidewalk." Her face went white, then red. People were openly watching now. I did not enjoy that, let me be clear. Public humiliation is ugly even when earned. But some acts insist on witnesses, because secrecy is what let them grow. "You're trying to ruin me." The sentence was so close to self-knowledge it almost hurt. "No," I said quietly. "You did something much sadder than that. You mistook my love for vacancy." For the first time since Nora's funeral, her expression broke. Not polished grief, not strategic tears, just breakage. She looked suddenly young again, not innocent, but young, lost in the wreckage of a self-story that no longer held. Oliver touched her elbow. She shook him off. Then, with hands that were no longer steady, she reached up and unclipped the rendering from the easel. One by one, she pulled down the boards. No one clapped. Thank God. Life is not a film, and ruin should not be applauded. Miriam told me later the whole block exhaled when I came back up the pavement. She said, "You look taller." I was not, but I understood what she meant. After that, the legal parts moved with the slow, unsatisfying machinery they always do. Some funds recovered, some did not. Lena signed an agreement through council acknowledging no ownership or agency in relation to Bellwether Books or the building or these accounts as part of her venture. The harder part was quieter.
For weeks, I would hear a footstep on the stair and think she was still upstairs. I would find myself about to ask her whether the festival posters had arrived, or whether that influencer woman had confirmed the date, and then remember the whole altered shape of things. Betrayal is not only anger, it is also habit with nowhere to go. The guest room stayed closed until October. When I finally opened it, the room smelled faintly of dust and the citrus perfume she always wore. On the windowsill sat one last thing she had not taken, a smooth gray stone from Nora's condo, picked up years earlier on some beach trip I had not gone on. I stood holding it for a long time. Then I put it in the drawer beside the bed, not displayed, not thrown away, just placed. Bellwether remained Bellwether, not unchanged, that is too neat and not even desirable. Some of Lena's ideas had not been wrong, only ungranted. We did improve the newsletter. We added online pre-orders properly on my terms. We repainted the children's nook but kept the mural. Miriam got her hours back and then some. Arthur, the poet, read in September to a standing room crowd that included more people under 40 than Lena would have predicted, which pleased me more than it should have. I rehung Daniel's sign myself. The latter felt less stable than it once had. My wrist ached by the third screw, but when I stepped down and saw the green and gold letters back where they belonged, something in the whole room settled. In November, almost exactly a year after Nora died, I received a letter. Not email, letter. Lena's handwriting on the envelope. I left it unopened on the kitchen table for 2 days before reading it. That was not strategy, only self-protection. Inside, 5 pages. No excuses, which surprised me. Some explanation, which did not. She wrote about the months after Nora's diagnosis feeling like watching the floor fall away, about moving into my apartment intending to recover, and then discovering how intoxicating it was to be useful somewhere that had shape and history and visible edges,
about seeing Bellwether as both refuge and proof that a life could be built, could endure, could mean something. She wrote that somewhere along the line, wanting to belong to it became wanting to become it, and then wanting to outrun the feeling that none of it was hers. There was one sentence I have thought about often since. I was so afraid of being temporary that I tried to act permanent. I do not know if that explains what she did. I know it names something true. At the end, she said she was sorry. Not for being ambitious, not for wanting more, for taking what was not offered and calling it vision. I wrote back 3 weeks later. Shorter letter, no absolution, no dramatic severing either. I told her grief is not a license. I told her talent without humility becomes appetite. I told her I loved her once without caution, and now with it. I also told her I hoped she learned the difference between building and occupying. That was in winter. It is spring now as I tell you this. The harbor has gone from iron gray to that pale, unreliable blue it wears before the season commits. School children come in sticky with candy after lunch. The bell on the door still rings slightly flat when it's humid. I have begun leaving the upstairs kitchen window open when I cook, so I can hear the shop murmur below. Sometimes, in late afternoon, when the light slides across the biography shelves exactly the way it used to when Daniel was alive, I will catch myself standing still for no reason anyone else could see. Just listening. Buildings do speak if you live with them long enough. What mine says now is not triumphant. It is not something simple like you won. It says, be careful what you call help when you are lonely. It says, some people do not mean to destroy a thing. They only mean to stand inside it until it takes their shape. It says, love is not permission. Grief is not permission. Talent is not permission. And sometimes, when I'm locking up and the street has gone dim and the brass of the old bell is cool in my hand, it says one more thing, quieter than the rest. Keep your name on your own door.